Alright, so listen. Firstly, I'll explain my almost 2-month long hiatus. To keep it concise, I basically initiated school a few days after posting my previous video. Given school started like 2 weeks before I initiated, I had a lot of work to catch up on and didn't have any time to power scale. Coupling this with procrastination, laziness, and working on other projects, you result in a nigh multi-month long break. Originally, I planned to return from my hiatus on the 14th of March as I decided that I would create a schedule where I'd post 2 times a month because my original schedule forced me to post once every week, which wasn't something I could realistically maintain. However, after some thought, I decided to post on the 10th, the 20th, and the 30th of each month, which would result in 3 videos a month while also giving me enough time to make each one at my desired pace, which brings us to today. Originally, the video that I was going to post to end my hiatus was going to be a longer, more detailed video than this one. However, I won't be able to finish it by the 10th unless I rush it, which isn't something I want to do given the argument-filled nature of said video. The video I'm talking about will be posted after this one and will probably be my second longest video to date. Something else to note is that I was planning to post the video you're currently watching on the 10th of this month. However, due to exams and laziness, I didn't get around to finishing it and posting it till today, whichever day it is. Anyways, that's enough about me and my hiatus. Now we'll talk about the topic of the video itself. Okay, so as you all may know, whenever I scale a series, I try to look at the multitude of metas it possesses from the point of view of someone trying to find flaws in it. If I do find any flaws in the argument of a specific meta, I both attack and defend it. What I mean by this is that I will try to figure out whether said meta is valid by making counter arguments and see if they stick. If they do, then I continue by evaluating which stance is, in my opinion, more valid. If the counter argument has more validity, then it's the one I add to my belief system. If the original argument has more validity, then I also add it to my belief system while also solidifying the argument. But the last part of the latter is not inherent. I believe this is something similar to what is known as the dialectic method. The only difference is that I usually do it with myself rather than with others. This is why many people will say that I attack arguments no one makes, but in my experiences, people will make these very technical arguments to support a position they have. I'm not saying that this is something bad, as I often do it myself, but what I am doing is explaining why I tend to attack these uncommon arguments. It's because I know that if I were to discuss a specific topic with someone, they'd probably mention it. Either way, the reason I do this is to be fair. I don't want to come off as a tard that just ranks every series or every verse I scale to the maximum degree, but I also don't want to be someone who's just an anti and wants to downplay a verse to the ground. However, due to the nature of power scaling, I tend to come off as the latter. The reason for this is that I've noticed many people have their personal biases and established beliefs about something. When you try to challenge that belief, especially in power scaling, people tend to become defensive and antagonistic, which is something I attribute to the culture created due to power scaling verses. Thus, when the vast majority of a community have accepted something to be true, and you enter that community to challenge that belief, you suddenly become the enemy of said community, which is what I've become to bleed scalers, as the belief I've challenged and will continue to challenge have been around far longer than I've scaled the series and have been accepted by the vast majority of people who scale the verse. The reason I say all of this is to clear up my position or the label that I've been given as the anti-bleed scaler, and say that today's topic is related to what I mentioned previously, a meta that not many people use but must be talked about regardless. So what is the meta, you ask? You probably didn't ask that given the context of the thumbnail and the title, but the thing I'll be talking about today is whether or not Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero is star level. You can think of this as an addendum to my book of Bleach debunks, and the way it'll be structured is that I'll first explain the meta's argument and the calc associated with it before going on to explain my contentions with it. I'll then finalize with a conclusion where I'll briefly explain why I don't believe this meta works. So without further ado, let's get into it. In chapter 280, Grimmjow charges and fires what he calls the ultimate Cero, named Gran Rey Cero. Ichigo holofies to block it before Grimmjow activates his resurrection and the fight continues. However, in chapter 282, it is stated that the atmosphere is distorting due to the effects of Gran Rey Cero, and we see a disturbance in the atmosphere as if there was a rupture in space, with the light around the rupture seemingly being warped. On page 73 of the Soul's databook, it stated that Ceros are beings of spiritual pressure. In chapter 9 of the second Can't Fear Your Own World novel, it's implied that zeros have volume, which denotes the three-dimensional space occupied by an object, and density, which denotes the concentration of matter. In the same chapter, Shinji implies that the Gran Rey Cero that are being shot out are strong enough to destroy the sun. Using these premises, the argument asserts that Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero is able to bend light due to the sheer amount of reishi that it contains. For those that don't know, reishi is basically the spiritual equivalent of matter. There is an occult and versatile wiki that people use, which attempts to calculate the amount of mass required to produce this effect by comparing it to the angle at which celestial bodies bend light due to their enormous amount of mass. Then by using the mass and the radius of the Gran Rey Cero, it attempts to find its gravitational binding energy, which would be the amount of energy required for this gargantuan mass of reishi to hold itself together. The value derived from this scales back to Grimmjow, since he is the one who created the attack. The Calc and Versatile Wiki puts it between 17 zetatons of TNT, or small planet level, and 712 tenatons of TNT, or star level. The low end assumes that the Gran Rey Cero bends light by 1 arcsecond, while the high end assumes 1 radian. 1 arcsecond is 1/306,000th of a degree, and a radian is 57.3 degrees, with there being 360 degrees in a circle. To put it into perspective, a degree is to an arcsecond what the Statue of Liberty is to an ant. Due to the arcsecond being such a minute unit, and the effects of light bending being actually visible to the human eye while also being significant, I'd say that the degree to which light is being bent is closer to a radian than an arcsecond. Given that I can see some people asking a few questions about the Calc and Versatile Wiki, I'll redo it using an angle of 1 degree and make the way I arrive at the conclusion more clear. According to NASA, the formula to calculate the degree by which gravity bends light is as follows. You can see what each symbol denotes. A quick correction here is that the symbol T means theta, which is a variable used to denote angle. I incorrectly equated it to radian, which is a unit of angle. In simpler terms, it would be like if I said M means kilograms rather than mass. The theta here is being measured in radians, so even if it doesn't create any complications with the result, I thought I should correct myself. Anyways, if we substitute the values and solve for mass, we arrive at the second formula you see. Using dimensional analysis, we can convert 1 degree to radians. Given the Calc and Versatile Wiki already calculates the diameter of Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero, all we have to do is plug in the value, which yields approximately 4 times 10 to the power of 24 kilograms. In the second scan, you can see the formula for gravitational binding energy. Solving for it and converting the values to tons of TNT results in 220 ninatons of TNT, which is large planet level. But this is a low end, and if we couple it with the statements about destroying the sun, one can easily assert that Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero scales to star level. And with that explanation out of the way, let's get into the counter arguments. Okay, so let me make the argument this calc is based on as clear as day. In literal terms, this calc is saying that Grimmjow created an orb that is a little over a meter wide but has a mass that exceeds that of the moon by orders of magnitude, with the high-end mass exceeding that of Earth's. It is then said that due to this immense amount of mass, an incredibly powerful gravitational influence is bending the surrounding light to the point the distortion is visible. So to start this off, my first contention is that the aforementioned notion is too inconsistent to be used. You see, if the argument this calc has a basis in were true, then at every point in its existence, this Gran Rey Cero would be bending light. However, it doesn't. In chapter 280, when Grimmjow fires it, we are able to still see him behind the orb of the attack with no visible gravitational lensing effect. In the same chapter, when the attack expands, we clearly see the pillar behind the attack, and our perception isn't distorted by gravitational lensing. It is clear that this isn't an enormous mass whose gravitational influence is bending light, because if it was, then everything I previously pointed out wouldn't exist. This is something that is even more apparent in the anime. Take a look. My second contention is to point out that this supposed light bending doesn't happen the way it would in real life, since rather than there being a gravitational lensing effect, which is what this calc uses as a basis, there is a visible tear in the fabric of reality in a horizontal manner following the dissipation of Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero. This effect that we see isn't an aspect of gravitational lensing, and the fact that it happens following the dissipation of Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero doesn't make any sense, since if it's gravity that's causing it like this argument asserts, which it clearly isn't, then the disappearance of this supposed enormous mass that caused this effect should result in the absence of this effect, not the opposite of it, which is what we see with this lingering distortion of space. With this explanation, we can establish that the warping of space isn't being caused by the mass of the Gran Rey Cero due to having distinct effects that should not be present and lacking the characteristics of gravitational lensing on numerous occasions. The fact that the warping of space does not occur while the mass is present, if not exists as a consequence of a dissipation, is a direct refutation to this calc. So if the warping of space isn't a consequence of a massive body, then what is it? Well, my hypothesis is that the warping of space is an inherent property of the Gran Rey Cero, rather than being an effect of its supposed enormous mass. My reasoning for this goes as follows. There's a scan whose origin is unknown to me, but is clearly official, which states that the Gran Rey Cero can only be used by espadas and is so powerful that it distorts the surrounding space. In the 9th chapter of the 2nd volume of the Can't Fear Your Own World novel, it stated that the Gran Rey Cero is a unique Cero that can only be wielded by espadas. It can warp space, it is differentiated from a normal Cero, and it is strengthened with blood, something the Unforgivens says is required to create a Gran Rey Cero, as it uses one's blood as a catalyst. Using all of this, my argument surrounding the nature of the Gran Rey Cero asserts the following. The Gran Rey Cero is a unique variation of an ordinary Cero that can only be wielded by a select few. It is achieved by drawing one's blood and using it as a catalyst, which results in a unidirectional emission of reishi whose power is extraordinarily greater than that of a normal Cero, and it has the ability to warp space itself in its wake. This argument makes far more sense than the one which the calc is based on, as the other explanation has a multitude of contradictions, and even the author of the calc themselves doesn't believe this scaling is valid. But I already know what y'all are saying. Well, what about Shinji stating that they were going to destroy the sun, and it mentions about density and the volume of reishi? Well, is Ken talking about the Gran Rey Cero of another character, or something akin to it, possessing a greater volume and density of reishi than a normal Cero, can easily be explained by saying that it's a figure of speech. In my video about the book of Bleach Debunked, I pointed out and gave multiple examples to support the notion that Kubo uses figurative language a lot, and not every single statement is meant to be taken literally. Moreover, within basically any novel you read or any conversation you engage in, people will use figures of speech as it is something that is a part of speech. So rather than interpreting the words volume and density in the physical sense, interpret it from a more informal point of view, where volume refers to just an amount of something, and density refers to the compactness or concentration of something. These interpretations stem from their definitions in physics, but can be used in other contexts. Like here, it's most likely being used to just say that the amount of reishi is very vast, while the degree of approximation between each individual particle of reishi is great. In other words, it is saying that this Cero is made up of a lot of reishi that is concentrated. Simple, and again, this makes more sense than saying as gravity warps space, which is far too inconsistent. The statement made by Shinji is also explained by figures of speech, since the author themselves state that he spoke lightly, meaning that he was not seriously saying that they were trying to destroy the sun. This example of a figure of speech is actually something common where I live, where when someone sees you doing something dumb, they'll call you out on it by exaggerating what your goal is with that specific action. For example, let's take the scenario if you wanted to swim in the sea. Let's say that you haven't learned to swim but have been training with a trainer for a few days and you want to try your luck at swimming on your own without any supervision. Thus, you go off and jump off a dock without anyone knowing, and after trying and failing to stay afloat, you suddenly realize how bad of an idea it was. Now you're swallowing heaps of salt water and will soon begin drowning. But before you lose consciousness and die, someone appears to save you. It was your trainer who was just passing by but happens to see that you were drowning and decides to save you. The first thing your trainer does is transport you back to safety, i.e. take you out of the water and carry you to the beach. After making sure that you're okay and don't require any medical attention, the first thing he says to you is, "What were you trying to do? Drown?" It's obvious that it's a rhetorical question, as the trainer doesn't actually believe you were trying to kill yourself by drowning. However, he asked this question in order to find out what you were trying to accomplish by jumping off a dock while being unable to swim and pointing out the idiotic nature of your action. Let's say the same scenario again, but rather than your trainer asking that question, he just asks you if you're alright and why did you jump off the dock while being unable to swim. Let's say some people pass by and hear what the trainer was saying, and one of them comments on the situation by asking the other, "Did you hear what he said? Apparently that guy on the beach jumped off a dock yet he can't swim." The other person responds by saying, "What was he trying to do? Drown?" Again, this is a rhetorical question to point out the idiotic nature of the stunt you performed, rather than seriously putting forth a valid explanation for why you jumped off the dock. Something similar is happening here. Shinji notices the strength of the Zeros is beyond that of any normal Zero. In other words, he notices a uniquely powerful Zero. Due to this, he wonders, why are there releases of such powerful attacks? Are they trying to destroy everything? In simple terms, that statement that Shinji makes is not an indication of the strength of the Gran Rey Cero. It's merely Shinji asking a rhetorical question, following him sensing vast amount of spiritual pressure being released. Combining this with everything I previously mentioned, I believe my argument holds far more merit than the one I presented here today, as my argument has valid explanations for things that seemingly counter it, while the argument that counters is riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions that make it unusable. Some food for thought is that if what bends space is the mass and the concentration of that mass, why hasn't any other attack in the series bent space like this? Like, I could list a plethora of abilities that are stronger than Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero and should have more Reishi than it. An easy one is the Cero released by Vastolor de Ichigo, which matched Ulquiorra's Ceros Oscuras. Mind you, this is Segunda Etapa Ulquiorra. Now that it's all said and done, I'll summarize the video. There's a calc versus Battle Wiki which scales Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero between small planet level and star level. The way it does this is by arguing that Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero has a mass which exceeds that of the moon, and on the high end it exceeds that of Earth. It arrives at these values via using an apparent bending of light caused by the Gran Rey Cero and comparing it to the degree to which other celestial bodies bend light. Using a calculated diameter that is slightly above a meter, it solves for gravitational binding energy and yields energy equivalent to the aforementioned tiers. Coupling this with statements that suggest that a Gran Rey Cero possesses immense density and volume, alongside the one which seemingly claims that it can destroy the sun, the argument that Grimmjow scales to star level seems to be pretty solid. However, when you actually analyze all the assertions and really understand what the calc is saying, the cracks begin to appear. The first one of these cracks is inconsistency. You see, the assertion that the gravitational force of this supposed miniature celestial body is what is causing the warping of space, an effect known as gravitational lensing, is contradicted numerous times. Moreover, the light bending effect doesn't occur while the Gran Rey Cero exists. If not, it is formed following its dissipation. This is a clear indicator that the argument is flawed. On top of this, the supposed gravitational lensing effect is also contradicted, as it has properties that should not exist. Thus, my argument comes in, where rather than the bending of light being caused by gravitational lensing, I propose that it makes more sense for the warping of space to be an intrinsic aspect of the Gran Rey Cero. This does away with the flaws in the original argument while also refuting the application of the calc. There are two apparent contradictions to my argument, and that's the mention of the Gran Rey Cero being able to destroy the sun alongside it having great volume and density. The thing is, if you actually analyze both statements, they can easily be chalked up to figures of speech. This isn't just a rationalization to make my reasoning consistent. If not, it's an argument I believe to be more plausible than the surface level interpretation. I thought this video was going to be shorter than it is, but I guess I failed at that task. But yeah, that's about it for now. Bye.